There is a part of you that has been running your life without your permission. It has been making your decisions, choosing your reactions, picking your enemies, and sabotaging your relationships, and you have never once sat down and had a real conversation with it. Most people spend their entire lives managed by something they refuse to look at directly. And the strangest part? That thing is not a monster. It is not your evil side. It is not the worst version of you. It is simply the part of you that nobody told you it was okay to be. What you are about to hear is not the version of shadow work you have seen 100 times. This is not about journaling your trauma or meditating until you feel peaceful. This is about something far more specific, far more direct, and far more confrontational, in the best possible way. This is about learning to speak, to actually open your mouth or pick up a pen and talk to the thing inside you that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, for you to finally acknowledge it exists. Carl Jung spent the better part of his career studying the hidden architecture of the human mind, and what he kept returning to, what he believed was the most important psychological work a person could do, was this: the integration of the shadow. Not the destruction of it, not the suppression of it, the integration. And the first step of integration is not analysis, it is conversation. But before you can speak to your shadow, you need to understand what it actually is. Because almost everything you have been told about it is incomplete. Your shadow is not your darkness. That is the first and most important thing to understand. Yes, it contains difficult material, anger, jealousy, greed, the impulses you are ashamed of. But Jungian analysts have been very clear on something that most people completely skip over. The shadow also contains your infantile aspects, your emotional attachments, your neurotic symptoms, and critically, your undeveloped talents and gifts. The parts of you that got buried were not only the parts deemed bad, they were also the parts deemed too much, too loud, too ambitious, too creative, too powerful, too free. Jung had a specific name for this. He called it the golden shadow. And the golden shadow is arguably the most important and least discussed concept in all of psychology. The golden shadow refers to the positive attributes, the talents, the potential that you have disowned. Not because they were evil, but because some part of you subconsciously decided they were unattainable, or dangerous, or simply not allowed. Think about what happens in a family where one child shines too brightly. The parents feel threatened, or the siblings feel overshadowed, and the message, sometimes spoken, more often silent, is, dim yourself, be less, do not stand out like that. And so the child learns. The talent goes underground, the ambition gets buried, the creativity gets labeled arrogant or impractical, and tucked away somewhere it cannot cause trouble. That buried material does not disappear. It becomes shadow, not dark shadow, golden shadow. And it sits there for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime, waiting. Here is where it gets even more interesting. Positive shadow material is often harder to integrate than the dark kind. Harder, not easier. Because claiming your own greatness, your own gifts, your own unlived potential, requires something the dark shadow does not demand. It requires you to change your life to express those capacities. It requires you to step into visibility, to accept responsibility, to stop playing small and start playing true. That is terrifying in a way that acknowledging your anger simply is not. And so people project the golden shadow outward. They look at someone else, someone confident, someone creative, someone who seems to move through the world with an ease that feels almost supernatural. And they feel this overwhelming admiration. Sometimes they feel it as awe, sometimes as envy, sometimes as a strange, aching longing they cannot name. That feeling, that intensity of admiration, that is your own golden shadow looking back at you. Jung was explicit about this. The person you most admire is showing you something you already have, buried deep, waiting to be claimed. But here is the thing about the shadow, golden or dark. It never waits quietly. It does not sit still. It creates chaos. And one of the ways it creates that chaos is by exhausting you. This point is almost never discussed, and it should be discussed in every conversation about mental health and energy and chronic fatigue. Suppressing the shadow costs energy. Significant, measurable energy. If you are perpetually tired, not just physically tired, but soul tired, the kind of tired that sleep does not fix, one of the most overlooked reasons is this. Part of your energy is being devoted every single day to keeping your shadow down, to maintaining the wall between what you consciously present to the world and what you have decided cannot be seen. That maintenance is exhausting. It is a full-time internal job that runs in the background of everything you do. And here is what happens when you stop running from it. When you begin to integrate the shadow, that energy comes back to you. This is not metaphor. Jungian analysts describe integration as producing a subjective experience of revival, a return to hope, a sudden sense of actually inhabiting your own life again. That is not the small thing. That is everything. That is the difference between going through the motions and actually being present for your existence. Now let us talk about the science, because what Jung described through years of clinical observation has since been backed by neuroscience, in a way that should completely change how you think about this. In 2007, a researcher named Lieberman published findings on something called affect labeling. What affect labeling means, in plain language, is simply naming what you feel. And what the research showed is that simply naming an emotion, putting a word to it, giving it a label, measurably reduces activity in the amygdala. The amygdala is your threat detection center. It is the part of your brain that fires when you feel in danger, and it is the same system that gets activated when shadow material rises to the surface, and your mind tries to push it back down. This is the neuroscience of why speaking to your shadow works. It is not mystical. It is not philosophical. It is biological. When you name the thing, when you turn toward it and speak directly to it, you are literally changing the chemistry of your brain. The grip of the unconscious material loosens. What was invisible and therefore unmanageable becomes visible and therefore workable. But the shadow does not only make itself known through fatigue. It has other preferred methods of communication, and the most powerful one is irritation. Think about the last time someone really got under your skin. Not a little, but disproportionately. The kind of reaction that was bigger than the situation warranted. The kind where somewhere in the back of your mind you knew your response was too large, but you could not stop it. That is your shadow. The intensity of your judgment toward another person is directly proportional to how much you have denied that same quality in yourself. Not sometimes, consistently, reliably. This is one of the most well-documented mechanisms in depth psychology, and it is called projection. Projection happens automatically. You do not choose to do it. Your unconscious mind takes the material it cannot look at directly and displaces it onto the person in front of you. And this is why projection is so hard to catch, because from the inside, it doesn't feel like you are seeing yourself. It feels like you are simply seeing them clearly. The person who enrages you with their arrogance, the person who disgusts you with their neediness, the person who infuriates you with their passivity. If the reaction is intense, if it is disproportionate, if it has a kind of charge to it that you cannot fully explain, look inward. Your shadow left a fingerprint. And it is not only dark qualities that get projected. The golden shadow projects too. The person whose confidence you find almost unbearable to be around. The artist whose freedom makes you feel a kind of grief you cannot name. The leader who seems to have a certainty you desperately want and cannot locate in yourself. These people are carrying your projection too. The positive kind. The unlived kind. The kind that points directly at what you have buried. Now here is something that almost no one talks about. Your shadow was frozen at the age it was repressed. Read that again, because it matters enormously. When a child experiences a quality in themselves being punished, shamed, or rejected, whether that quality is anger, ambition, sensitivity, sexuality, creativity, that quality goes underground. but it does not grow underground. It stays at the developmental level it was at when it was exiled. This is why adults with fully functional rational minds can still respond to certain triggers like a 7-year-old. Because part of them is 7. That part never got the chance to mature. The anger that was shamed in childhood never developed into healthy adult assertiveness. It stayed immature, leaking out either as explosive outbursts or as total emotional shutdown, depending on which direction the person learned to go. Shadow work is, among other things, the process of going back and giving that frozen part the chance to finally grow up. And you do that by talking to it. By treating it not as an enemy, not as a problem, but as a neglected part of yourself that has been trying, in the only language it knows, to get your attention. Jung developed a very specific technique for this. He called it active imagination, and it is one of the most remarkable tools in the history of psychology. The process is essentially this. You identify a shadow aspect, anger, neediness, pride, the quality you most dislike when you see it in others, and you give it a form, a figure, a presence, and then you sit with that figure and you speak to it, not about it, not at it, to it. You ask it questions. What do you need? What are you afraid of? What have you been trying to tell me? And then, and this is the part that most people skip, you listen. You take the answers seriously, even when they are uncomfortable, even when they surprise you. This is not a visualization exercise. This is not positive thinking. Active imagination is a genuine dialogue with your unconscious, and Jung was emphatic that it should be treated as a real conversation, not a performance, not a rehearsal, but an actual exchange between your conscious ego and the material that has been running in the dark. One technique that can make this more concrete is to give the shadow a name, a face, a voice. Imagine sitting across from it, not fighting it, not running from it, just being present with it. What does it look like? What does it sound like? What is the first thing it says when someone finally gives it permission to speak? The simple act of personifying it begins to transform your relationship to it. It stops being a force that acts on you from the outside and starts being a part of you that you can actually get to know. You can do this in writing. You write as yourself, and then you write as the shadow, letting it respond without censoring, without editing, without deciding in advance what it is allowed to say. This journaling form of active imagination is often where people have their most profound breakthroughs, not because some new information is revealed, but because they finally stop pretending a part of them does not exist. Now here is something that should completely reframe how you think about shadow work. There is a specific kind of person who has the densest shadow of all. It is not the obviously troubled person. It is not the person who acts out. It is the person with the most rigid, most carefully constructed persona, the most publicly virtuous, the most visibly good. The reason is simple. The more intensely you maintain a particular image of yourself, morally upright, selfless, spiritually advanced, always calm, the more material has to be pushed underground to sustain that image. The shadow grows in direct proportion to the gap between who you present yourself to be and who you actually are. This is why the most loudly righteous figures so often have the most explosive falls. The shadow was never integrated. It was just driven further underground, where it built pressure until it had no choice but to erupt. Jung said something about this that was quietly devastating. He said that becoming enlightened does not happen by imagining figures of light. It happens by making the darkness conscious. In other words, you do not transcend the shadow by becoming more spiritual. You transcend it by being more honest. There is also a social and collective dimension to the shadow that most personal development conversations never touch. Jung argued that groups, cultures, and nations have shadows too. The collective shadow is the material an entire society decides is unacceptable, and like the personal shadow, it does not disappear when it is denied. It gets projected, outward, onto outsiders, minorities, enemies, scapegoats. The violence that erupts between groups, the hatred, the dehumanization, is in Jung's framework mass shadow projection. An entire population seeing in another group the qualities their own culture has refused to acknowledge in itself. Understanding this does not excuse the violence, but it does explain something important. You cannot heal collective hatred without doing personal shadow work. Because the collective shadow is only ever the sum of individual shadows that never got integrated. And here is something that research has confirmed about what the shadow costs us socially and personally, not just emotionally. A study of over 1,000 participants found that habitual emotional suppression, the core mechanism that creates and maintains the shadow, is consistently associated with lower well-being, poorer social outcomes, and reduced life satisfaction. The shadow's toll is not invisible. It shows up in the quality of your relationships, the quality of your choices, the quality of your life. What you suppress, you pay for, not once, but continuously. Your shadow also communicates through your dreams in ways that are far more literal than most dream interpretation suggests. Recurring figures in dreams, the stranger who threatens you, the monster you cannot escape, the dark figure at the edge of your awareness, these are, in Jung's framework, shadow materials seeking recognition. Your unconscious is not being cryptic for the sake of it. It is sending you the most direct communication it can manage from where it is. When you start doing shadow work, these dreams often shift dramatically. The monsters get smaller, the strangers become less threatening. Sometimes they become allies. There is one more mechanism worth understanding before we talk about what actually changes when you do this work, and that is what happens to your relationships when the shadow is active. When you are projecting shadow material onto people around you, something very specific happens to your capacity for clear thinking. Projection does not just distort how you see the other person, it takes away your ability to think rationally about situations and relationships involving them at all. This is why there are certain people in your life, perhaps certain family members, certain colleagues, certain types of people, where your thinking simply clouds over, where something shifts in your reasoning that you cannot quite explain. That cloudiness is projection. Your shadow has overlaid your perception of reality with something it needs you to look at, and until you look at it, your vision in that area stays distorted. Imposter syndrome, too, is a shadow manifestation that is almost never framed this way. Imposter syndrome is typically treated as a confidence problem, a mindset issue, something to be overcome with affirmations or cognitive reframing. But at a deeper level, it is the experience of a split between your persona, the capable, functional self you present to the world, and your shadow, everything you believe yourself to secretly, actually be underneath that surface. The fraud feeling arises because part of you knows the gap is there. The solution is not to make the persona more convincing. The solution is to close the gap. Not by dismantling the capable self, but by acknowledging the full self, the parts you hide, the doubts you carry, the qualities you have not yet let yourself own. And this brings us to the most counterintuitive truth in all of shadow work. The goal is not to destroy your shadow. It is not to eliminate it, transcend it, or leave it behind. It is to stop being surprised by it, to develop what Jung called a conscious relationship with it. Integration means you know the material is there, you understand where it comes from, and you choose, consciously, deliberately, how to respond to it. Instead of being hijacked by it, instead of acting it out without realizing what is happening, instead of spending the rest of your life managed by something you never agreed to be managed by. When people commit to this work, when they begin to actually speak to their shadow, in whatever form that takes, the changes that occur are not small. Relationships clarify, because projection decreases, and you start seeing people as they actually are, rather than as what you need them to carry for you. Creative energy returns, because the golden shadow stops being locked away and starts being lived. Physical energy returns, because you are no longer burning it on the maintenance of a wall. Emotional reactivity decreases, not because you feel less, but because you understand more. The triggers that used to throw you lose their power, not because the underlying material disappears, but because it has been acknowledged, named, given a seat at the table, instead of a locked room in the basement. This is what speaking to your shadow actually does. It does not make the difficult parts of you vanish, it makes them legible. And once something is legible, you can work with it. You can choose. You can finally exercise the one freedom that the unexamined shadow never allowed you. The freedom to decide who you want to be, rather than simply becoming whatever your shadow dictates. Shadow work is not the destination. It is a door. On the other side of that door is something Jung spent his whole life trying to articulate. Wholeness. Not perfection, not purity. Wholeness. The integration of every part you have exiled, every quality you have buried, every gift you have been too afraid to claim. The person you actually are, rather than the person you decided it was safe to become. The shadow has been speaking to you your entire life. Through your anger, through your exhaustion, through the people who infuriate you, through the people you cannot stop admiring, through your dreams, through your longing, through every moment where your reaction was bigger than the situation warranted. It has been trying in every language it has to get your attention. The only question is whether you are finally ready to answer.